we will talk about pathways and integrative functions within the brain and spinal cord. So we'll start out with first, you guys, is basically just characteristics of nervous system pathways. So we'll talk about how the spinal cord communicates with the brain and peripheral tissues. Then we'll differentiate different types of sensory pathways and motor pathways, and then get into some higher order processing and integrative functions like learning and memory and things like consciousness. And so if we're going to first start out, you guys, talking about pathways. So we know that the central nervous system, or brain and spinal cord, communicates with peripheral tissues through what are called pathways. And these pathways either conduct sensory or motor information. So they're actually separate pieces of information that are carried in different tracts or different pathways. Now, you won't have pathways that carry mixed sensory and motor information. So what this means then is that in the spinal cord, like in the white matter funiculi, you're going to find bundles of axons that either carry sensory neurons or bundles of axons that carry motor neurons. They won't mix in the spinal cord. They stay separate. So they travel through the white matter of the brainstem, through the spinal cord, and they can either exit the central nervous system through spinal nerves or cranial nerves. So cranial nerves are the ones that emerge from the brain, and those can carry sensory or motor pathways. Spinal nerves, emerge from the spinal column or spinal cord, and those contain sensory and motor pathways. Now, a pathway always consists of a tract and a nucleus. A tract is a bundle of axons, and a nucleus is a collection of neuron cell bodies somewhere in the central nervous system, like the brain or the spinal cord. But a pathway needs at least both of these, right? Because the axon has to come from somewhere. So the axon here that forms a tract is associated with the nucleus of a neuron, somewhere in the brain and spinal cord. Now, the nucleus is a collection of neuron cell bodies in the CNS, and our tract can work with multiple nuclei throughout the CNS. So you might find a nucleus in the spinal cord as well as nucleus in the brain, and they're connected by tracts. Now, ascending pathways, they're going to bring information up towards the brain. They're always sensory. It makes sense. How we said that sensory is afferent, which means towards the central nervous system. If it's an ascending pathway, information's ascending in the spinal cord. So if information is going up the spinal cord towards the brain, it's going to be sensory, right? You won't have a circumstance where there's motor information, ascending up your spinal cord into your brain. That will make sense because there's no muscle in your brain, So basically, ascending pathways are sensory because they carry sensory information from your body to the brain. Descending pathways are motor. We also call this efferent, away from the central nervous system, because they transmit information from your brain and spinal cord out to some muscle tissue somewhere in the body. If it's somatic motor, it's skeletal muscle. If it's autonomic motor, then it's smooth muscle and glands. Now, most of these pathways we have, which are sensory or motor, most of them decussate or cross. So decussation is a crossing from one side of the body to another. So a lot of sensory pathways then will cross from the left side of the body to the right side of your brain, and vice versa. Sensory information from the right side of your body can cross to the left side of your brain, or motor information can cross too. So most of these pathways decussate or cross. Now, contralateral is the word we use to describe pathways that are on the opposite side, or ipsilateral is a word we use to describe pathways that are on the same side. Now, most of these pathways exhibit point-to-point correspondence, which we call somatotopy. Now, going back to our chapter on the central nervous system, we talked about how in the primary somatosensory cortex, which is the postcentral gyrus, or the primary motor cortex, which is the precentral gyrus, there was a homunculus man, and the homunculus man was just sort of the cartoon characteristic, person that was laid up across the gyrus of the primary somatosensory cortex, the primary motor cortex. And then on the homunculus man, there were like large hands and large feet and small torso and large face. Well, the size of those organs correlated or corresponded with the amount of brain area that corresponded with that particular body part. So, for instance, we have large parts of our brain that correlate with nerve endings in our hand because our hands are very sensitive, right? We also have large portions of our brain that correlate with the muscles of our hand because we can have very fine motor control over our hand muscles. So this point-to-point correspondence between brain and body is what we call somatotopy. Somato means body, topy means kind of map. So somatotopy is actually a body map we have in our brains, which is interesting. And the evidence for this is if you can find the parts of your brain that control muscles of your body, and you shock those parts of the brain, you can get specific body parts to twitch or move, right? So you can identify, what part of the brain controls your index fingers. And if you shock those, then you can actually make someone's index fingers stick out, right? And it's pretty consistent. And the fact that there's point-to-point correspondence, we call somatotopy. Now, all pathways have tracts, and these tracts are basically big bundles of axons. Oops. And most pathways are composed of a series of 2 or 3 neurons. So most pathways won't just be one neuron and one axon. It will typically be multiple neurons in this chain of events. So you might have, like a primary sensory neuron, a secondary sensory neuron, and a tertiary sensory neuron, where neurons synapse on another neuron, which synapses on another neuron as it goes down the line or down the chain of events. Now we're going to first talk about the sensory pathways here. Remember, all sensory pathways are ascending. They all take information up your spinal cord towards your brain. And they're going to carry information about things like limb position, touch, temperature, pressure, pain. All this is carried to the brain, where the brain can process this information further. Now, somatosensory pathways process stimuli from skin, muscle, and joints. And viscerosensory pathways process stimuli from your viscera or internal organs, right? Which one of these you guys think is more likely to be conscious, somatosensory or viscerosensory? Somatosensory, right? Like we're conscious of our skin, muscle, and joint position. That makes sense. Now we can get some conscious sensation from our viscera. Like we understand that there's pain in our viscera, but we understand that there's pressure, like in our bladder, if there's pressure in our stomach because we just had lunch and we're really full, right? We know that we can feel those things, but we're not always conscious of the information that's being sent to our brain from our gut. There's certain things that we're not conscious of. An example of this is like we're not conscious of our own blood pressure, although that's considered visceral sensation, right? Our brain actually receives information about our blood pressure, but we're not conscious of that. Like we don't know what our blood pressure is consciously unless you have it read, externally, and you can see what your reading would be. Now, in terms of the sensory pathways, you guys, we have primary, secondary, and tertiary neurons. The primary sensory neuron, its cell body is in the dorsal root ganglia. Remember, the dorsal root ganglia was associated with the spinal cord, and a ganglia was a collection of nerve cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. Now, the dorsal root ganglia has a unipolar neuron. So that's one neuron with a long, slender process. That long, slender process extends away from the dorsal root ganglia out to some sort of peripheral organ or tissue, right? Like your skin, muscle, joint, or viscera. And then that process, it comes back to your spinal cord towards the dorsal root ganglia, but it passes through the dorsal root ganglia and then synapses on interneurons in the spinal cord, okay? That's the primary sensory neuron, so you're going to find it in the dorsal root ganglia. The secondary sensory neuron you're going to find in the dorsal or posterior horn of your spinal cord. That's going to have the cell bodies of secondary sensory neurons. So these sensory neurons in the dorsal horn receive information from the primary sensory neuron that picks up information from the periphery. Okay? Then that secondary sensory neuron sends an axon up the spinal cord, right, through some sort of tract. And there's different sensory tracts. Now, up the spinal cord, then that secondary sensory neuron can synapse on a neuron either in the brainstem or the thalamus. So, if it synapses in the brainstem, it could be involved with certain reflex pathways, things like regulating, blood pressure, respiratory rate, that kind of stuff. Otherwise, if it synapses in the thalamus you find the tertiary sensory neuron that then goes out and connects to some sort of cortical region, which is involved with like conscious thought. So think about this as just sort of like hot potato. Basically the primary sensory neuron picks up information, and then it passes that information on to the next neuron, right? And the secondary sensory neuron, the spinal cord, picks up that information, and then it passes it along to the next neuron in the thalamus or brainstem. And then from there, the information gets sent elsewhere, okay? Now, we have several main pathways for our sensory pathways. And we're going to first talk about these somatosensory pathways. Now, remember, these pathways are basically a tract and a nucleus that's going to involve the spinal cord, right? So we're talking about basically big bundles of axons in the spinal cord somewhere. So earlier we talked about how the spinal cord has white matter, and there's the funiculi. And in that white matter funiculus, we have big bundles of axons. And those bundles of axons carried specific pieces of information. I know it's hard to, you don't really see that though. Remember, we looked at the spinal cord just like one big solid white outer covering, right? But I'll give you guys an example though, like that could actually start to, if you had a spinal cord, you could actually kind of, take that apart like string cheese. The axons in the spinal cord are kind of bundled together, and you could pull them, those bundles, apart like string cheese, right? Like the
Why do
food.
you always make relative?
I know, right? Well, it is. It would be. So that's the best example because you guys know food, so that's what makes sense. I'm not trying to ruin string cheese for y'all. If that ruins your appetite, you guys have a long, hard career ahead. So, basically these bundles of axons, and they're going to carry specific types of information. So these somatosensory pathways include things like the posterior funiculus, the anterior lateral pathway, and the spinocerebellar pathway. Remember the posterior funiculus we talked about earlier. That was just between the two dorsal horns, right? It's in the posterior part of the spinal cord. All that white matter in the posterior funiculus there, it's also called the medial lemniscus pathway, but what it carries, those axons back there, is information about limb position, precise touch, precise pressure, and vibration. But what I mean by precise touch and precise pressure is, very finely feeling these things. Like if you can very finely feel that there's a little bit of pressure somewhere in your fingertips, like if you're feeling the texture of something, or vibration, right? That information precisely is carried by the posterior funiculus. So if someone has damage to the posterior funiculus on their spinal cord, then they may lose this type of information, right? Including limb position. So they might have difficulty understanding where their limbs are located. They might also have difficulty feeling things precisely. Not crude touch, precise touch. They might feel that something's in their hand, but they couldn't tell you what it was unless they saw it with their own two eyes, right? So that's the posterior funiculus. Now, the anterior lateral pathway, which you find on the lateral parts of the spinal column or cord, basically like in the lateral funiculus, it carries information about crude touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. So in a very crude way, just understanding that there's pressure, pain, temperature present, that information is carried by the anterolateral pathway. That's that particular sensory pathway. Now the spinocerebellar pathway, this one's actually interesting because it's necessary for maintaining postural inputs. So, the spinocerebellar pathway is going to pick up information about your body's position, like in your current state. That information is sent along through this pathway here, big bundle of axons, and it goes directly into the cerebellum. Now, we've learned last week how the cerebellum's involved with things like movement and balance. So it makes sense that the spinocerebellar pathway sends postural input to the cerebellum. That way the cerebellum's getting information about what position your body currently is in, right? And then from there, it can make adjustments if necessary. So we got three main pathways here for the somatosensory pathways, right? We have the anterolateral, which is for crude touch, pressure, vibration, and pain. We have the posterior funiculus, which was for more like limb position, precise touch and pressure, and vibration, as well as the spinocerebellar pathway, which sends postural input, like it gives information about what your body's position is in, straight to the cerebellum. That way the cerebellum can actually process that and actually decide what to do with that. Example of when you would use your spinocerebellar pathway, guys, is if you're going to trip. Like if you just tripped on something. Like you're walking along, you trip, right? All of a sudden, you find yourself, your body's in a different position, right? And you could potentially fall over. But because your body's in a new position, well, you're getting information to your cerebellum, and your cerebellum can process that information about your current body state and then make the appropriate adjustments to make sure that you don't actually fall down. And so that cerebellum is constantly getting this input about your body's position. So it's pretty cool. Now, we can see this where it's located in the spinal cord. All of that's shown in blue here are the sensory pathways. So you can see our anterolateral pathway over here. We can see our spinocerebellar pathway over here, as well as the posterior funiculus, right? So what did the posterior funiculus carry? What type of information? Precise touch, pressure, vibration, and limb position. Precisely, though. Like understanding that only these two fingers are up for peace, right? Not just understanding that, hey, there's some fingers pointing up, but it's precisely these two fingers. Or understanding that, if you grab an object, that you can feel that there's little discrete rubber buttons on here. And I can tell it's rubber just based on how it feels precisely, right? That's going to be all the posterior funiculus. That makes sense. Now, what about the anterior lateral pathway? Yeah, crude touch, pressure, pain, vibration. So just in a very crude way, understanding that those things are present, but maybe not understanding precisely what that is. So that the anterior lateral pathway would then help you understand that there is something in your hand. Maybe not carry enough information to help you figure out what that thing is, but just know that there's something there, right? So you can imagine that would help with like reflexes, where you don't need really discrete information other than the fact that there's maybe pressure, vibration, pain present. And then what about the spinocerebellar pathway? What does that carry? Postural input to the cerebellum, right? So it's still part of your somatosensory system because you're getting information about joint position and muscle stretch, and then information sent to your cerebellum, where the cerebellum then can process it and then make appropriate adjustments based on what you're trying to do, right? If it's just stand or sit, that's pretty straightforward. But this is still going to even play a role with more complex movements and behaviors, things that require a lot of very intricate movements. I'm trying to think of an example. I guess gymnasts, that's a good example. It's a pretty classic example of very, very fine postural control. But yeah, you guys know what I'm saying. Now, we're going to do next, you guys, move on to talk about the motor pathways here. And the motor pathways, they're all descending. So if they're motor, they're carrying information down your spinal cord, away from your central nervous system. So what's another word for that if it's away from the central nervous system? Efferent, right? Good. Efferent. And the reason why I pronounce it like that, you guys, is that it just makes it to sound more distinct. Technically, you'd say efferent, right? But efferent and afferent, right? I can't even get away from saying afferent. Efferent and afferent sound very similar. So I say efferent and afferent, just to make them sound more distinct. But the efferent system is a motor system that carries information to muscles. Yeah.
I don't know. For me, it helps to think of gas effervescing out of liquid.
Oh yeah, I like that. I do like that. That's a good one. Yeah, effervescence of gas out of a liquid, out of your nervous system to the muscle. Now, this motor pathway, you guys, can regulate skeletal muscle activity, so it can regulate basically the skeletal muscles, which are typically under conscious control. And what this information comes from then is basically areas like your cortex, so like your primary motor cortex, which is the precentral gyrus, and your frontal lobe. There's nuclei there, and gray matter that's involved with planning and initiating motor movements. That information is sent down through the cerebral peduncles, down through the pyramids, down your spinal cord, where then it exits the spinal cord through a specific spinal nerve, and then that specific spinal nerve goes to a specific muscle of some sort, right? Like we talked about how musculocutaneous goes to biceps brachii, brachialis, corpus brachialis, or radial nerve goes to all the extensors. Well, what we mean by that then is the axons from these that you find in these nerve fibers, they're projecting to those muscles, but they're all part of a specific descending projection tract. So what this slide shows you guys is in red all of those different motor tracts that exist in the spinal cord. You can see they're kind of mixed around. You do see some motor tracts on the posterior part of the spinal cord, kind of over here by the anterolateral spinocerebellar pathways, right? But most of these motor tracts are actually on the ventral side, which is consistent with the idea that the ventral horns here have motor neurons, right? So it makes sense that their motor tracts are nearby. Now for these motor tracts, we have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. An upper motor neuron is one whose cell body is either going to be in the cerebral cortex or within the brainstem. So remember, the cerebral cortices that are involved with controlling muscle movement, think frontal lobe. So your frontal lobe's got the primary or upper motor neurons that are involved with things like planning and initiating motor movements, as well as your brainstem can have some of these too in terms of reflexes. Now, lower motor neurons have their cell body either within the anterior or ventral horn of the spinal cord or within a brainstem cranial nerve nucleus, like if it's going to be a cranial nerve carrying motor information out to like a facial muscle. Like facial nerve controls most muscles in the face, so that if you're going to move a facial muscle, then what's going to happen then is an upper motor neuron in your frontal lobe can communicate with a lower motor neuron in your brainstem, which then can have an axon that leads through a cranial nerve, like facial nerve, to excite a facial muscle. Right? Makes sense. Now, otherwise, if it's going to lead through a spinal nerve, then the lower motor neuron would be in the spinal cord. Now, upper motor neurons can excite or inhibit the activity of lower motor neurons, but lower motor neurons are always excitatory because the axons connect directly to skeletal muscle. So upper motor neurons can be inhibitory or excitatory. What this means, you guys, is that they can either excite, like make it more likely that a muscle contraction would happen, or inhibit, or make it less likely that a muscle contraction would happen. And it makes sense you would need both, because this is how we prevent ourselves from having random muscle contractions. You know, that we have to kind of dampen down this sort of white noise of random activity in our nervous system. So we need a little bit of inhibitory processes too. However, the lower motor neurons are always excitatory because their axons directly attach to muscle. And that means they're always excitatory because all these motor neurons release acetylcholine directly onto the muscle, which is always going to excite that muscle. You can't directly inhibit muscle through nerve activities, not skeletal muscle at least. Now, we have direct versus indirect pathways. Direct motor pathways are conscious. Indirect motor pathways are unconscious. Okay? So remember how, going back, we said that all skeletal muscle is under conscious control? That's mostly true. But we also know that you don't always have to think about moving skeletal muscles. You know, like I told you guys that your respiratory diaphragm is actually a skeletal muscle. Well, you'd say, okay, well, that is not under conscious control. Well, yeah, of course it is. But you don't have to consciously think about breathing. Like your brain can actually control that for you, right? But if you wanted to control that muscle, you know, consciously, you could. Like you could deliberately and intentionally take a deep breath in or exhale. Now, the difference between these pathways, you guys, the direct motor pathways, what we mean by that they're under conscious activity is that you only use these pathways deliberately and consciously, right? When you want to do something, you will use a direct motor pathway, like consciously. Otherwise, if you're talking about just maintaining body position and posture, think indirect motor pathway, where it's under unconscious control. Luckily, we all don't have to think about maintaining our posture right now. Like, we're not all sitting here going, oh, well, I better contract the muscles on my back to keep my back upright, right? So, because if you did that, yeah, it would, because you have to think really hard about what you're doing all the time, and you'd be so occupied about just trying to stay upright, you couldn't think about anything else. So luckily, postural muscles are under indirect pathways, which is under unconscious control. Okay? However, you can still consciously control the same muscles if you want to. So the direct pathways include your corticobulbar, lateral corticospinal, and anterior corticospinal tracts. These are three descending pathways, and if they're direct, is that conscious or unconscious? Conscious, good. So the corticobulbar tract is one that controls muscles of facial expression through cranial nerves. So remember, there's different cranial nerves that control muscles of facial expression. The major cranial nerve that controls most muscles of facial expression is facial nerve. However, there are some other cranial nerves, like trigeminal nerve controls chewing muscles. And the corticobulbar tract is the one that consciously controls facial muscles. Okay? So if you like intentionally, you know, make a fake smile or something, or intentionally make a fake frown, right? You are using this corticobulbar tract. Okay? Now, what do you guys think would happen if this were damaged?
You can smile.
Yeah, you might have, okay, I like that. Maybe you get facial tic, like abnormal muscle contractions, or facial muscle paralysis. You know, when do you see facial muscle paralysis?
Stroke.
Yeah, sometimes it can happen in stroke, right? So a lot of times strokes can affect the upper motor neurons, like in the frontal lobe, that would control things like your corticobulbar tract. And that's why you would get paralysis, is that then you don't have control over these kinds of tracts, because the upper motor neurons are now dead or damaged. But the way I think about this, you guys, if your head's a big bulb, right? It's a big old bulb on top of your body, and the cortex means bark, like the outer part. Think of the corticobulbar tract as controlling, you know, the muscles of the big bulb on your body, which is the head. Makes sense. The lateral corticospinal controls movement of your limbs, and this is easy to remember, right? Because limbs are even kind of lateral. Think about where your limbs are in anatomical position. They actually are lateral to your midline. So the lateral corticospinal tract controls muscles of your limbs. Like you're consciously using a limb muscle of some sort. That's the lateral corticospinal tract. And the anterior corticospinal tract think anterior like axial. Axial is right in the midline. The anterior corticospinal tract controls axial muscles, which are involved with posture. Remember, the axial muscles involve ones of your trunk, like the what do you call that? Erector spinae on your back, or the rectus abdominis on your belly side over here, and those would be controlled by the anterior corticospinal tract. It makes sense. When you think anterior, think axial muscles, postural muscles. So when you think lateral corticospinal, what comes to mind? Limbs, right? And is it because it's a direct pathway? Is that under conscious or unconscious control? Conscious control. You got it. And when you think cortical bulbar, like a bulb on top of your head, yeah, muscles in your face. You got it. So makes sense. Now the indirect pathways are the ones that are unconscious. Okay, so these are the ones that are going to be more involved with things like controlling posture and that kind of stuff. Now, all these indirect pathways are under unconscious control, and we have lateral and medial indirect pathways. The lateral pathway here is we have the rubrospinal tract, which controls the flexor muscles of your limbs, but in an unconscious way. Okay, think of rubro like kind of red, and muscles are red, and so think of rubrospinal as controlling the flexor muscles of your limbs, right? Now, the medial pathway includes your reticulospinal, tectospinal, and vestibulospinal tracts. Now, the reticulospinal tract controls automatic movements for posture and balance. So you guys are all using this right now, by the way, because it takes energy and effort to actually keep your body upright. Otherwise, you can slump over and just fall on the floor without this. And that can happen. Now, the tectospinal tract is involved with visual and auditory reflex. Again, this is under unconscious control, hence the idea of a reflex, right? Now the tectum, we talked about in lab, because one part of the tectum includes the corpora quadrigemina, which has your superior and inferior colliculi. Remember, the superior colliculus of your midbrain was involved with visual reflex, so like, flinching in a reflexive way to a visual stimulus. And then the inferior colliculus was for auditory reflex, right? So, doing something in a reflexive way in response to a sound. So when you think of tectospinal tract, think tectum, think reflex pathways for visual and auditory systems. So, if you think about if you hear a noise, on the right side of your body, you might reflexively duck to avoid that thing if you hear it coming at you, right? So that would involve your tectospinal tract. And then the vestibulospinal tract is one that's involved with balance during sitting, standing, and walking. Now, this vestibulospinal tract differs from the reticulospinal tract because reticulospinal is more of just general automatic adjustments to posture and balance. But this vestibulospinal tract also uses information from your balance system or vestibular system. Now, we'll get into this in AMP2, but there are some structures in your inner ear that help you understand your head's position in space. You can use this information about your head's position in space to also make adjustments to the rest of your body. So I'll give you guys an example. Let's say if all of a sudden it felt like your head was tilting a lot to the side, right? Well, we don't have to think about doing this. Luckily, it's under unconscious control. But if all of a sudden it felt like your head's tilting off to the side and it's getting picked up by your vestibular system, you can have automatic adjustments to your body to make sure that you don't actually fall over and tilt over, right? And so that there's a little bit of communication here with your vestibular system and postural muscles with the vestibulospinal tract. Okay. So what does the rubrospinal tract control? Flexor muscles of your limbs, right? So flexor muscles of limbs, like flexion or flexion. So it controls those automatically. How about the reticulospinal? Yeah, just general adjustments to posture and balance, generally. Okay. How about the vestibulospinal tract? Yeah, balance during sitting, standing, walking, but it also requires information from your vestibular system, and that's what it's using it to make these adjustments. So you might wonder, why sitting, standing, and walking? Well, with these particular activities, you want to be upright in a certain way, and so the way your body knows it's upright is using your vestibular system, which is part of your inner ear. You can actually get this information. And then last but not least, you guys, the tectospinal tract. I didn't do it. Tectospinal tract, what's that involved with? Reflex. I was trying to scare you all in a reflexive way to make that point, right? Tectospinal tract, visual auditory reflex. I wasn't very good at it though. Everyone's like, whatever. I should probably just get an air horn next time, right?
Yeah.